This morning's first conversation surrounds the fact that the media has been under criticism from some in authority, some with great power and influence as it relates to the reporting and how reporting on crimes, alleged crimes, misconduct or injustices can actually be a fair factor that only contributes to the situation or the ever-evolving situation here in Trinidad and Tobago. Well, I'm pleased to welcome to the program the President of the Media Association of Trinidad and Tobago, Ms. Ira Mathur. Good morning, Ms. Mathur.
Good morning.
Well, thank you very much for joining me. Let's start the conversation by asking, given how Trinidad and Tobago is evolving and the fact that the media has been touted as a fourth estate, precisely how would you describe the role of the media as it relates to reporting? In fact, more specifically, is it effective in getting the messages and the job done, as we'd say?
Yes, the media has been described as the fourth estate, and very rightly, because we are the one institution that holds up all the other institutions. We are the watchdog that holds people to account, holds institutions to account. And in fact, recently on World Press Day, we put out a release. This is the Media Association of Trinidad and Tobago, that out of 80 countries, we in the last year, we've come up 5 points so that we're number 25 out of 180 countries worldwide in terms of press freedom. So I would say that the media in this country are more than doing their jobs and doing them on the whole responsibly.
How crucial is the role of the media in promoting democracy and any sort of attempts to stifle or influence media? In Trinidad and Tobago, do we see such taking place? For example, there have been arguments that not all media houses are invited to sit in press conferences. Not all of them are actually invited to cover what would be deemed as crucial announcements by those in authority. So are we seeing that taking place here in TNT, though you just mentioned our improvement in the World Press Freedom Rankings?
Of course, I'll have to agree, especially during COVID. I think what happened was media were really restricted. Photographers were restricted, from going into Parliament. We had some kind of restrictions to cover the president's event in Tobago. There were other times. There was more recently, some people were in uproar about the fact that not everybody was invited, not everybody who wanted to attend was invited to the Prime Minister's media conferences. We wrote to the Prime Minister's office, and since then that problem seems to have been resolved. So the issue with the media is that we have a different agenda, right, to the government. Our agenda is to be the watchdog, to hold people responsible, and their agenda, I suppose, is to show they're in charge and do what they in politics. And what I believe that the Media Association of Trinidad and Tobago, particularly in the last 2 years, has been really strong on catching every occasion where there have been attempts to keep us out. And we have, I think, fairly successfully succeeded in getting a much larger of our force into the mainstream. I mean, for instance, during COVID, you must know that media were restricted, especially in the health conferences. And what Matt did was we got questions from all over and we passed them straight on to the health minister. So I think the idea of eternal vigilance is important. And because we are a strong institution, I think we've got about 180 members right now. And we've got a very strong chat group with some veterans, some new people, people in new media. And I think for the first time, photographers and technical people were extremely strong, and we have been pushing back.
This agenda that you speak of, is it that we have been, effective in ensuring that we carry out this agenda? Or is it that there are media houses or even media personnel who follow the status quo for the sake of survival?
When you say follow the status quo, I'm not quite sure what you mean.
I meant keep ourselves in line. For example, we don't have a choice but to actually report only on certain things. We're restricted in terms of reporting. for the sake of actually still being able to be a part of certain events or certain avenues for, I suppose, survival?
I mean, in all countries, and especially in countries like ours, where we had 600 murders last year, there is obviously there's going to be some level of self-censorship, which I don't agree with. But I think our media has not gone that way, and of course we've had to be careful, for safety, and I will completely condone that. I think reporters need to go as far as they can with all the safety tools in hand, making sure that somebody knows where they are, making sure that they are safe, making sure that they cover events safely and they're out of there safely, because media are in the front line, right? We were in the front line during COVID, in terms of getting COVID, in terms of our own health. And we are also citizens. So if a reporter goes out to cover a story in the dead of night, you hear of a murder. I mean, obviously, you don't expect that reporter to jump out of the car right in front of a big crime scene and, ongoing crime scene. They have to ensure that police are there. So I would actually say that our media are very, very free. I think what you may be referring to, I mean, I'm not sure. Maybe you could give me some examples of what you're speaking of in terms of self-censorship and not being free and kowtowing.
Well, there have been reports that indicate rumors, of course, within the media fraternity that there are some journalists who are actually biased in terms of their reporting, again, simply because they have no choice. There's also some understanding that some media houses have had to actually restrict some of their representatives, their journalists, from asking questions or even attending certain press conferences by the instructions given by those in authority. I'm not entirely sure if you're aware of that, but it is something that, from my position, I've heard multiple times.
But I could tell you that people in our association, if they were not allowed to ask questions, if they were put down in any way, there would be an uproar. It's a very, very vibrant group. So, as soon as there's a suggestion of that, we act. I'd really love to know some examples. But I think what you're also speaking of is that perhaps some media come across like we're also citizens in addition to being media. And you're saying that some media houses come across as biased. Is that what you're saying, that some stories are biased? Against or for the government?
There have been suggestions of such. As it relates to examples, we know how this works. For the sake of not calling any one media house or any one journalist on air, I'll be more than happy to share with you information off air.
But I mean, in like all allegations, we need some examples, right? But if you check the media in the UK, for instance, various media houses are fully within their right to take certain political stances, right? So if you read the Daily Mail, it's extremely right-wing. It's always pro-government and it's always pro-conservatives. It's, so you actually know the line that you're going to get. And if you read The Guardian, it's an extremely liberal paper. It's fairly left-wing. And you actually know what kind of stories that you're going to get in The Guardian. Similarly for The Telegraph or The Economist, because The Economist is going to take a very pro-business line, The Telegraph is going to take a very pro-business line, and other papers may not. So these biases are allowed once everybody knows that is who you're working for. So if you're working for the Catholic News, there's going to be a bias towards spirituality and God and those things. If you're working for specific newspapers that need to target specific audiences, that's completely acceptable. But I think in the cases that you speak of, with all due respect, I think you are also one of us, right? You're part of the media. It's so easy when you're in the public eye. Our agenda is different to everybody else's agenda. For people to throw shade at us and say, and have kind of dark forbiddings of, we are following a party line, or we are against some government, or we're against some minister. I think concrete examples always need to come up, because we can't live in a shadow of a fog of, as a small country, sometimes we're like a little village, right? And somebody gives a rumor here and there, and very needlessly, the reputations of our colleagues are sullied. So I'm all for coming out and saying it was on this occasion, this happened, and this person was not allowed to attend a conference, and this person, was kept out, and this person was told from the editor that they couldn't write a story. When we have that, we can cope with it a lot better.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I would agree with you on one of the points that you just made there, that it's very easy for names to be sullied within the public domain. Even in terms of my position, you're absolutely right. Many a times with debates on current affairs and what's taking place, the public tend to be, rather critical rather than constructive. So I definitely, and I do actually like the example of you using the British press, because everything that you said there, I'm very much aware of. But beyond that, if we take a look at what Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, the head of the Central Division, mentioned a month and a half ago, that media reporting spreads fear in Trinidad and Tobago. We even heard from Honourable Minister last week speaking about children's homes and not focusing so much on the negativity. In terms of that, could the media report facts and bring these stories to light without actually spreading fear, in the sense that could you separate both, or is it that it's impossible given the nature of the stories?
Well, I think you've brought up some really, really crucial issues. When I started off as a young journalist, I remember there was one horrific photograph in the front page of The Guardian. I was in television then, and to see this in the newspaper, it was that of a headless body, just a face that had been severed. A head that had been severed. It was in the front page, and those things are extremely gory. Or if there have on occasions been vulnerable children, in places where they should have been protected. But I'm sure you're aware that currently we are the 6th most murderous country in the world. Last year, 600 people were murdered, among them 50 women, and people. If you're following the newspapers, which of course you are, people are living under fear. Mm-hmm. And I actually think that journalists have been amazing in covering crime alongside covering the other crucial issues of the country that affect us. We've been covering the economy, we've been covering crime, we've been covering foreign affairs, and anytime, the editorials have been calling government out on various issues. So I actually feel that the media in this country, we've been doing our jobs, which has always been what is our role? Yes, to be the fourth estate, to hold all the other institutions, the judiciary, the parliament. We have to hold them to account. Similarly, we're not making up these stories. We're a mirror of the country. So if we turn into a country where it's fairly safe, and say there are 20 murders a year, you won't see so much on the pages. You won't open up the Express, Guardian, Newsday, and all the other newspapers and all the, everything online and just see murder after murder after murder. The truth is, there's 1.6 murders a day. Some of them are horrific. Last week or the week before, there were, the assassination type gunshots on people, on families. Mm-hmm. Whereas before, you thought that certain things were sacred, that even when there were shootings, they would protect the children, they would protect women and the elderly. That's not happening. Elderly are being shot, children are being shot, citizens are being shot. And if we, the media, don't stand up and say something, then who is? And, similarly to the government, we have a different agenda. And I have no problem with anybody in the police service saying the media are doing this, they're sensationalizing it, because that's their agenda. And incidentally, when I speak of the police, I have to say that in general, the police have been extremely competent in working alongside journalists. They have been providing the numbers. The TTPS has been very open in terms of the kinds of murders that have taken place. In every crime journalist, because it's a very specialized area, yes, has their own trusted contacts. So I think the police in general and the people that we have and the police officers that we are dealing with are extremely responsible. We are just doing our job. So, it's like saying, we are almost like a conflict. We're racing into the area with that kind of murder rate into a country with conflict. And so in a country with conflict, if you don't report the murders, the killings that happen, then you're basically shoving your head under the sand and you're protecting everybody else. And that's not our job. In fact, I think the media ought to be commended, hugely commended, for coming out. Because remember, we're also citizens. Every day, media workers go out to crime scenes. They go all over the place. They don't have the protective gear that the police have. They're going all over. They're writing stories. There are bylines on the stories. And they are just as much, and they are very, very vulnerable because they're public figures, and people can find them easily, and they're reporting the truth. So I think more than ever, right now, media need protection.
Certainly, but beyond that, how has also the growth and the influence of social media impacted upon mainstream media reporting? I know you just used the example of when you first, started as a journalist, that example of a photo on the front page of a newspaper. And now we see that taking place quite a bit on social media. In fact, many people get their news via social media. So how has social media, its growth and its influence impacted upon mainstream media reporting?
I think it's been a monster. It's been a two-sided, it's been a monster on the one hand for us. I mean, in my time, I have been known to go to the library for information. But I think social media has done untold damage, created an entire wads of disinformation, and we didn't see it so clearly as we saw it during the pandemic, right? Because people were saying that there's a really wonderful phrase that Christian Amanpour brought up, and the idea of false equivalence. You don't take fake news, or you don't take news that is obviously has not been checked and verified and put it in front of scientific news from trusted sources and say you need to compare the two. And that was what was happening during COVID. Another example is, if you're actually reporting in a war-torn country, you don't actually, there's a false equivalence, which, one of our very, very prominent members of the Media Association, Soini Gray, and she's also a member of the ACM, she brought up, and that's the idea of false equivalence, the same thing that Christian Amanpour spoke of. The example is mine, you can't, for instance, cover a tank going into a country and kind of raising over 3 children and, speaking of that they both have an equal voice. There's obviously some perpetrator and there's obviously some victim. The way that we can stay, it is a huge headache for us. The social media, it's been a help. In some ways, we can get our stories out there much faster, but then so can so-called citizen journalists. I think they're the bane of journalists' lives, because with social media, everybody seems to think that they have the vocation of being a journalist, whereas in fact, journalism is a vocation. It's almost a sacred vocation where you're guarding the fourth estate. You're making sure that you check your stories and you check them again and you get verified, you get verified information, and you have this on the other side. And the only way that journalists can beat that is by being extremely good, by setting such a standard that no citizen journalist could come up to it, so that when our stories go out there, people are still coming to us for the truth.
Mm-hmm. My final question to you, Ms. Mathur. Who is to hold the media to account? For example, who will be the biggest critic constructively? Would it be a body such as the Media Association of Trinidad and Tobago? Who would be the biggest, I suppose, critic of the media and their role, and the role in which they play in terms of Trinidad and Tobago and how society is evolving?
That's such a good question. I think actually, who is going to hold us accountable? You know who holds us accountable? The entire public, every single day. You're out there every single day. You mess up, whether it's with your pronunciation or with a fact, the entire Trinidad and Tobago, or whoever's watching your channel, is going to be on you. And that's happened to me in the past when I've skipped out one or two words. I've made an error in a column, and I've been attacked ruthlessly. And that is what happened there. If we are here to hold institutions to account, and that's why it's such an amazing organization that you and I are part of. We're holding institutions to account, but the country is holding us accountable. So every time we mess up, there are 1,000 people who can write letters to the editor, 1,000 people, even now with social media, who can go out and actually say false things about us. There are so many avenues to complain about journalists. There's also the TTPBA, which is the Publishers Association, which has a specific complaints body against journalists. You can write to editors, you can write to senior reporters. There's many, many ways of holding journalists to account. And you know how it's not easy being in the public eye, because in our jobs, it's not like we're an accountant or, when we mess up on certain numbers, somebody quietly comes and tells us that's wrong. When we mess up, or if I say something wrong, it's not just you that's going to hold me to account. It's the entire association of media. Can you imagine all our journalists who are extremely bright and extremely, on top of things? It's the politicians, it's the police, everybody holds us to account. So I hope that answers your question.
It certainly does, Ms. Mathur. And again, yes, I truly understand the position that you sit in and some of the experiences, because even I myself, most recently as of Friday, you face it all the time with respect to public scrutiny. But Ms. Mathur,
Yes.
Thank you very much for your time this morning, and thank you very much for highlighting the role of journalists, and even sometimes how journalists go far and beyond, and perhaps greater respect is needed, because we truly do not understand what journalists do and how far they need to go or have to go in order to get that job done. So thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yes.